be back. Thank you for having me here to preach the word again. Let's see, that's kind of low. Oh, well, we're going to be in Psalm 18 today. I had someone in the office from CAC today, or last week, and they asked me if the new pastor was going to speak today. And I said, well, I hope not, because I'm speaking on Sunday, and nobody said anything to me. But hopefully the new guy will be here next week, and so there you go. So the 25th anniversary of, becoming an attorney is next week, next Monday, the 30th. And when I first started out, I didn't really know how to do anything. They kind of throw you out there if you can pass the bar. And so I had to figure out everything for the first time, and it was really a struggle. Even getting customers was a struggle, because who wants to go to a brand new lawyer to do legal work for them? Well, nobody wants to do that. So it's a lot better after you've been doing something for 25 years. And Brenda, she retired from Young Life last month. She said I could tell you, after 20 years at working with Young Life. And that's what she told me, anyways. And there was a party, but we're waiting to see how it goes. But that was an adventure for Brenda, full of a lot of joy, a lot of struggles, a lot of accomplishments. Many middle school and high school kids from Canby area met Jesus through Young Life. A lot of them gave their life to Jesus through the work that Young Life did. And others who were already Christians, they deepened their walk with Jesus through the work that Brenda and Young Life did over the years. So we're in a pretty good stage of life now, and we've got a lot to thank God for. Our kids are grown up, and they're getting on with their lives. And when you're raising kids, it's a real struggle. Raising kids is a struggle. You're broke all the time. That's a struggle. Kids can be a struggle. But our kids seem to be headed in the right direction now. And so they get to struggle just like we did. We're both committed to walking with Jesus. He's brought us a long way from when I gave my life to him as a young kid at Molalla Nazarene Church. And Brenda gave her life to Jesus at Malibu Club, a Young Life club. And so hence Brenda's love for Young Life. And walking with Jesus can be a struggle too. There's lots of temptations, lots of trials, but there's no better joy than walking with Jesus. And so we both can sing a song to God for delivering us from the enemy and from our struggles over the year. But of course, we also know that there's going to be more struggles in the future. We get to help our parents navigate the last years of their lives. I know some of you are in that place. We might face health issues ourselves. I have this stool here in case I need to sit down because my knees are shot. And my artificial knee is acting up this week. We're married, and being married can be a struggle sometimes, at least for Brenda. I don't have to struggle. And who knows what other struggles may come along down the road. And so it's good to have Jesus walking with you as you try to navigate the struggles of life. And so here the superscription of the Psalm 18 says, for the director of music, of David, the servant of the Lord, he sang to the Lord the words of this song when the Lord delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. And so that gives us a little time reference. David must have written it after Saul has left the scene and after he's defeated all of the enemies around him. And so he's been made king, he's defeated his enemies, and he thinks about all that God did for him, and he writes the psalm. And so that would place it right around 2 Samuel 7:1, because it says there, after the king had settled in his palace and the Lord had given him rest from all his enemies around him. Psalm 18 is also reprinted at the end of 2 Samuel chapter 22, but I have to think it was written earlier in his life and then reprinted back in 2 Samuel 22. Now Psalm 18 is a long psalm, and so I hope you put your lunch on a timer, because we may be here a while. No, we're going to have to skip over a lot of it. And Alan Ross, a tremendous Hebrew scholar, he calls it a royal thanksgiving for divine intervention in battle. And some of the headings today are from Dr. Ross. So do you ever feel like you're in a battle and you could use some divine intervention in your life? Or maybe you've already experienced divine intervention in your life and you could sing a song to God of thanksgiving. Or maybe you're just starting out in life, just starting out in marriage, just starting out raising children, or starting out in your Christian walk. And someday you would like to sing a psalm to God for his divine intervention in your life. And so this psalm is for you if you have any of those thoughts. Well, like us, David's life had many twists and turns before he got to this day when he could write this psalm. So I thought rather than parse a bunch of Hebrew verbs for you, I would recount David's life for you, and then we can put this psalm in a little better context. I think that would be more helpful. So we first hear about David in 1 Samuel 13. Saul has been rejected by God as king, and Samuel tells Saul, now your kingdom will not endure. Saul's been disobedient. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him as leader of his people, because you have not kept the Lord's command. So God has sought a man after his own heart. And what does it mean to be a man after God's own heart? Could be a woman after God's own heart. Here's what the Theological Word Book of the Old Testament says. It says, in biblical literature, the heart is the most frequently used term for man's immaterial personality functions, as well as the most inclusive term for them, since in the Bible, virtually every immaterial function of man is attributed to the heart, emotion, thought, or will. And we've heard about the heart before. So in 13:14, our verse, there's a little preposition ket attached to the Hebrew word for heart, lavav. And the preposition ket, it means according to. And back in Genesis 1:26, we have the same preposition before the word demut, which is likeness. And so we are created in God's likeness, or according to God's likeness. And so when people are someone after God's own heart, we are thinking, living, and loving like God. We are being the way we were created to be before sin damaged our heart, before it damaged our emotions, thoughts, and our wills. And here's what Chuck Swindoll says about a person after God's own heart. A person after God's own heart is someone whose life is in harmony with the Lord. What is important to God is important to you. What burdens God burdens you. When he says go to the right, you go to the right. When he says stop that in your life, you stop it. When he says this is wrong, and I want you to change. You come to terms with it because you have a heart for God. That's bottom line biblical Christianity. Now, Saul was not a man after God's own heart, and he proved it by what he did on multiple occasions. And now he's been rejected by God, and God has sought out another man to be king over his people. We'll meet this man after God's own heart for several chapters, and when we do, he's out in the fields near Bethlehem tending sheep, his father's sheep. And I'm thinking it's just a normal day tending sheep, and someone comes out and says, hey, you've got to get home. They need you back at home. And maybe the someone says, you've got to get home because Samuel is at your house. It's not every day that Samuel shows up at your home in Bethlehem. So David's been missing a family meeting. And we know from earlier in 1 Samuel that God sent Samuel to Jesse's house, David's house, to anoint the next king of Israel. But he didn't give Samuel a name. And Jesse has 7 sons. So Samuel looks at the oldest son and he says, surely the Lord's anointed is standing before the Lord. But God says, that's not the one. Man looks at the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. And I've always thought that's a pretty good verse for finding another pastor for a church. Well, Samuel runs out of sons, and he asks Jesse, is there not another? And Jesse says, well, yeah, they're still the youngest, but he's out tending sheep. And so they send for David, and then Samuel anoints him as king over Israel. Of course, the youngest in the family are always the best and should be made king. We all know that. But David seems to be an afterthought to his father and to his brothers. Apparently, nobody thought that David was king material, but God did, because God looks at the heart. And so, wow, David went with Samuel and assumed the throne over Israel. Oh, I think it's broken. Yeah, there we go. No, he goes back to tending sheep for his father. Sometime later, Saul, the king, he's still acting as king. He's afflicted by an evil spirit sent by God. And so he brings David in to play his guitar, to make music, to soothe his evil spirit. And it works. The music helps. Now that's a troublesome thought, that God would send an evil spirit to afflict somebody. Very troubling. But it did get David into the royal court, and so he gets to learn what goes on in the royal court, how a kingdom works, how maybe it shouldn't work, and so it's to his advantage. It's going to be very useful when he takes over as king. Well, then in chapter 17, the Israelites are fighting the Philistines. And Jesse sends David to the battle zone with some supplies for his brothers and to bring back news of what's going on with the war. At this point in time, David's going back and forth from Saul's palace to his home. Well, the story of David and Goliath is very famous, so I don't have to tell you all about it. Goliath is huge. He's 9 feet 9 inches tall. So he's over 2 feet taller than Shaquille O'Neal. And Goliath's not awkward. He's not only huge, he's a fearsome warrior. And he's so fearsome that nobody is willing to go out and take him on in single combat. And he's taunting these people for their cowardice. But David, he takes him on, and he knocks him down with a sling and a stone, and then he cuts off his head with his own sword. And so the story of David and Goliath is a very good story for taking on and defeating the giants in our lives with God's help. If God is for us, who can be against us? But it takes courage to go out and face up to the giant when there's no reason to think that you could beat the giant. You can only do it with God's help. And so it takes courage, it takes a strong faith, which David has. Well, all the time that David has been tending sheep comes in handy when he's facing Goliath. He's taken on bears, he's taken on lions, and so he knows how to fight other creatures. And all the time we spend doing what we think of as mundane things will come in handy when we're facing the giants in our lives. The time we spend in Bible study and prayer, the time we spend coming to church, the time we spend going to small groups, the time we spend working at our jobs or taking care of our family and our house. All these things God will use to prepare us for what's coming down the way. And another thing, David, he's just a little kid here. He's not very old. And so there's absolutely no expectation that David would be the one to take on Goliath. He could just go back home to Bethlehem and tend the sheep, and nobody would think anything of it. Really, it's Saul's problem, because Saul is supposed to be the king, and he should fight the giant, or it's something that one of his grown adult warriors ought to do. Maybe David's brother Eliab, who Samuel said, "Oh, the anointed of the Lord is standing before me." He's chicken to go out and take on Goliath, and understandably so. And so they all look like they could fight the giant, but David had the heart to do it, and that's what made the difference. So why did David fight the Philistine? It says in 17:26, he says, "Just who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" And so David is concerned for God's honor and about the disgrace that Goliath is bringing on the people of Israel because they won't fight him. They're scared. And so David is actually acting like a true king and like someone who is after God's own heart. Well, after David kills Goliath, he leads the army out and defeats the rest of the Philistines. Now, it was supposed to be single combat, where if you beat the other guy, his army will turn themselves into you, but that's not the way it worked out. So he chases them down, and then they come back, and Saul gets very jealous and angry, because when they come back, people are singing, "Saul has killed his thousands, and David has killed his tens of thousands." And so he's very jealous. And he's also still afflicted by the evil spirit sent by God. It's going to work. I feel it. There we go. Well, a couple times, Saul gets so angry that he throws his spear at David while David's playing his guitar. He wants to pin him against the wall and kill him. But David escapes. It would be pretty strange to go to work and have your boss start throwing spears at you because he's mad at you. I suppose it happens metaphorically to you guys, but my boss is a very kind man, very, very loving. Later, David wants to marry Saul's daughter, Michal. Michal loves David, and David loves Michal. But he doesn't want Saul to give her to him for nothing, and this is the culture at the time. And so Saul says, well, okay, the bride price is going to be 100 foreskins from the Philistines. And so he's hoping that David will go out and get killed by the Philistines when he's trying to gather these 100 foreskins. The Philistines are not going to cooperate with this. So David goes out and he gets 200 foreskins, and Saul's plot is foiled again. And it probably made him even more angry. Well, so we're up to chapter 20. David and Saul's son Jonathan, who's his very good friend, they come up with a plan to determine whether Saul really wants to kill David. Now, I guess attempting to pin him to the wall several times and sending him out to get 100 Philistine foreskins was not enough evidence. And so they do their plan, and they determine that, yes, Saul really does intend to kill David. And so David leaves, and he spends the rest of 1 Samuel wandering around Israel because he's afraid of Saul trying to kill him. And so David goes to all places Gath. Gath is Saul's hometown, and it's a city in the Philistine territory. And it turns out to be a big mistake. Who would have thought that going to Gath would be a mistake? And so David has to act like he's insane. And the king says, well, I don't need any more crazy people around me. Get him out of here. And so he escapes and doesn't get killed. But that's probably one time when David was not asking God what he should do before he did it. He just did it on his own. And so we all make mistakes, and especially when we try to do things on our own without talking to God first. Well, David's lost almost everything by now. He's lost his position in the palace, his position in the army. He lost his friend Jonathan. He lost his wife Michal. And now he's lost his dignity too. And so he's got nothing that he had before. And Chuck Swindoll says that these things that David lost were in fact crutches that he relied on instead of relying on God. And God kicked the crutches out from under his arms so he would learn to depend on God. So it might go the same way for us. We aren't going to be able to sing our song of victory unless God kicks our crutches out from underneath us. Because we must depend on God if we're going to have the victory. And you know, you could think of crutches we have. We have our jobs, our careers, our money, our health, our spouses, our kids, our parents, our church, and so on and so on. So David's on the run. He's lost everything, and he starts picking up people who follow him. There are some from his family that didn't think he was such king material. Others are people who were in distress or in debt or discontented, the Bible says. And so that sounds a lot like the people who followed Jesus when Jesus was wandering around the same place. Maybe some of us would qualify as those things. And Saul continues chasing David. And one time Saul goes into a cave to relieve himself. The Bible is just right out there with this stuff. And it turns out that David and his men are hiding out in the back of the cave. And the men say to David, oh, this is the day the Lord spoke of when he said, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish. So David kills Saul and takes over as king. No, David doesn't kill Saul. Instead, he sneaks up and cuts a little corner off of Saul's robe. Then afterwards, he feels guilty for even doing that. And he says, the Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, the Messiah, that's the word for Messiah. Or lift my hand against him, for he is the anointed of the Lord. And so David goes outside and confesses to Saul. He says, I could have killed you, but I spared you. I'm not guilty of anything, but you are still chasing me around trying to kill me. And that's amazing. The normal response for us would be to say what David's men said. Look, God has given me this tremendous opportunity. I'm going to take advantage of it. But David, he lives by principles instead of what is easy and expedient. And so think about how often in your life you've had an opportunity to wrongly take advantage of someone or of some situation. And I say wrongly because God will bring opportunities our way to take advantage of. Well, it happens again in chapter 26, and this time Saul and his men have almost caught up with David, and they're sleeping because God has caused a deep sleep to come over them. And so David and his nephew Abishai, they go and sneak down to where Saul is, where they're sleeping, and Abishai says, oh, today God has delivered your enemy into your hands. Now let me pin him to the ground with one thrust of my spear. I won't strike him twice. But David says, who can lay a hand on the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? As surely as the Lord lives, the Lord himself will strike him. Either his time will come and he will die, or he will go into battle and perish. But the Lord forbid that I should lay a hand on the Lord's anointed. He did take Saul's spear and water jug and then went up on a hill and taunted Saul and his bodyguard Abner from the top of the other hill. So David has two golden opportunities to kill Saul and theoretically take over as king. But he left it up to God to decide what would happen to Saul and when. And so these were tests, and David passed them. In chapter 27, then David goes over and lives with the Philistines again because he's tired of being chased around by Saul, and he's afraid that Saul will eventually succeed in killing him. This time, the Philistine king likes him a lot and takes him in, but it's not a wise choice, and it probably shows a lack of faith on David's part. God has told him he's going to be king someday. Is God going to allow Saul to kill him? I don't think so. Well, the Philistines march to battle against Saul and the armies of Israel, and it looks like David is going to go with them. And that's weird, if you ask me. David's going to go fight against his own people. But God intervenes, and the other leaders of the Philistines, not the king who likes David, they say, come on, we can't go into battle with this guy. He's going to turn on us in the middle of the battle. And so the king sends David way down south to Ziklag, and that's where he is when the battle is going on. And then Saul and Jonathan, David's friend, both get killed in this battle, and David hears about it when he's in Ziklag. And he writes a lament for Saul and Jonathan in 2 Samuel 1. How the mighty have fallen, he says. Well, then David's anointed king over Judah, and as I was sitting here, I thought I should have a picture of Aragorn, son of Arathorn, up there. He's kind of a David figure, a Christ figure in Lord of the Rings. But, next time. Then there's war between Judah, David's army, and Israel. Abner, Saul's general, has gone and gotten Saul's son Ishbosheth, and Abner has made him king over Israel, and so they're fighting. Eventually, Ishbosheth is murdered, and David becomes king over Israel too. And then he defeats the Jebusites and takes over Jerusalem, and and makes his royal city there, and he brings the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, the presence of God. The Ark of the Covenant is the presence of God. He does have a failed attempt along the way. And then in chapter 8, which we think comes before chapter 7 chronologically, David has defeated all of his enemies, the Philistines to the west, the Moabites to the east, Aram to the north, and the Edomites to the south. And so as it says in the superscription, the Lord has delivered David from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. But what a journey David has been on. So David's a shepherd again. He's a shepherd over God's people, Israel. And what song does David sing to God about the God who protected him and delivered him all these times when David called upon God, and even sometimes when David didn't call on him? Well, he wrote Psalm 18. There we go. He starts out in verses 1 to 3 saying, I love you, O Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock, my fortress, my deliverer. My God is my rock in whom I take refuge. He is my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. I call to the Lord who is worthy of praise, and I am saved from my enemies. Notice how personal it is. I love you, Lord, my strength, my rock, my deliverer, my rock, my refuge, my shield, the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. I call to the Lord and I am saved. And so David is remembering all of these events that transpired in his life. And he's singing this song of praise to God for the one who made it all happen and brought him through. And then in verses 4 to 29, David tells us how God has a history of using supernatural means to deliver those who put their trust in him. That's from Dr. Ross, by the way, in case I'm ever up for confirmation hearings. These things will come out. All right, we're going to have to skip ahead, but do take some time to read those verses. A lot of what's in there sounds like the Exodus, or maybe the conquest in Joshua, or maybe it's what God did for Israel in history. It might be a particular battle that David's remembering that we don't have a detailed account of. But here I thought I'd give you a few times when God used supernatural means to use somebody, or to deliver somebody that I know. And I know this guy pretty good. When I was in 5th grade here in Canby, my brother and I went down to walk over the train trestle that goes across the Molalla River. That's our train trestle there. And we walked across the bottom rung of the trestle. And don't ask me why we did that, because I have no idea why 5th grade boys do what they do. Maybe Pastor Nick knows, maybe Brenda knows. But it was January or February, because the river was very high, moving very fast. And then about 2/3 of the way across, I fell off the trestle and into the water. Well, I didn't know how to swim at the time. And so I was flailing about and heading down the river. And my brother, he was off the trestle already, and he handed me out a branch so I could grab onto it, and he would pull me back to the shore. But the branch was rotten and broke when I grabbed a hold of it. So it's looking pretty grim, and I felt like it was feeling pretty grim. But I had on this poofy coat because it was winter, and as I was hurtling towards the water, it filled up with air. And so it kind of acted like a life jacket for me. And I I learned very quickly how to dog paddle, and I made it over to the shore and didn't drown. And so then we went back up to town, and we sat under the dryer vents at Bo's Wash and Dry. Remember Bo's Wash and Dry? So we could dry off, because my mom owned the restaurant next door, that's Taco Bell now. So we got dried off, and then we went over to the restaurant. But we didn't tell Mom about it for years, maybe decades. So there's the verse there. God reached down from on high and took a hold of me and drew me out of the deep waters. So I'm thankful for that time. Who knows how many other times God has intervened supernaturally in my life, and I don't even know about it. We'll find out someday. Then I have a couple here in honor of Brenda. Here's another one. Before the Big Muddy Ranch became Washington Family Ranch, a Young Life camp, it was owned by the Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh. There he is with his mugshot. After he vacated the premises forcibly, a billionaire, well, no, I get back up here. There was a fire. There was a big fire on the Big Muddy Ranch, and it came and it went around the camp site, went around, missing everything that became the camp, except for the Bhagwan's mansion. The fire came and burned up the Bhagwan's mansion, and I find that really humorous. And it's on there. A newspaper reporter said, "It's like the fire picked the house," said Lonnie Malding, who manages the Big Muddy Ranch, which includes the compound where the guru, known for his gold bracelets and collection of Rolls Royces, once lived. It's nothing but twisted metal and melted glass. Then after Bhagwan left, a billionaire named Dennis Washington bought the ranch, and he wanted to turn it into a resort. But the ranch is zoned exclusive farm use, and you have to have a conditional use permit to do a resort when it's EFU. So he couldn't do it. The neighbors were not excited about it. The government officials were not excited about it, so he couldn't get his permit. Someone from Young Life approached him, and he told them, "Well, if you can get the permit, I'll let you use the camp." And so Young Life went around talking to all the neighbors and convinced them that everything would be okay. If there was a camp there, Young Life is not the second coming of Rajneesh. Eventually, Young Life got their conditional use permit, and you can see what they do there. Eventually, I think Washington gave the ranch to Young Life, and then he would show up every now and then, and he'd say, "Well, why aren't you using that? Why aren't you doing this?" And they would say, "Well, we don't got any money." And he would say, "Well, how much do you need?" And then he would give them a check. And he's not even a believer. So that was pretty awesome. Well, when the Rajneeshis were there, they had big trouble having enough water for what they were doing. And so they trucked it in. And then when Young Life was there, they had big trouble having enough water for camp. And one day, someone was digging with a backhoe, and he hit a spring. And the spring provides more than enough water for what Young Life needs to do. So that's a miracle. This is Malibu Club in British Columbia. It's beautiful, beautiful. In the 50s, a guy built a resort there. I think might be sort of the original building there. And a lot of famous people went up to visit. But it wasn't really financially viable because of the short season. There was only like 2 months when the weather was fitting. Plus, there's no roads. There are no roads to Malibu Club. You have to get there by boat or by seaplane. And so it wasn't viable. And the owner said, "Well, I'm just going to sell it," and he wanted $1 million for it. So Jim Rayburn, who founded Young Life in his dorm room at Dallas Theological Seminary. He got in touch with him somehow, and the guy went and toured some other Young Life camps, and he sold it to Young Life for $300,000. And here's another view of Malibu. It's beautiful. This is where Brenda gave her life to Jesus, right there. Here's a story from a guy named Tyler Frankie. Kyler writes, he says, our final story will take us all the way to 2005. On June 16th of that year, 40 to 50 people were gathered for a meeting at Canby Alliance Church at 900 North Juniper Street when a fire broke out. The building was quickly evacuated, but Pastor Tim Barton and 2 other congregation members lingered in search of an unaccounted for teen. Barton went into the offices and called 911 before becoming trapped and disoriented in the thick black smoke. It was dark, he recalled. I could feel the heat and the pressure, so I dropped the phone, got on my knees, and tried to crawl out of there. He managed to find an exit door, but he didn't crawl out. He was blown out. The intense pressure from the blaze blew Barton an estimated 20 feet across the parking lot. Fortunately, he sustained only minor injuries, scratches, and bruises. The fire caused an estimated $750,000 damage. Canby Alliance Church was later rebuilt at the same location, bigger and better than ever. And I think Pastor Tim would say, God is my deliverer. And we have the cross up here that reminds us of that event and God's intervention in the life of Canby Alliance Church. And you probably have your own examples. I asked a couple people about the miraculous things that they've seen over the years here. And they told me about healings, various healings of people. They told me about somebody who forgave a drunk driver who killed a loved one. And I know another family that did that. That's amazing. We know about the miraculous coming together of our partnership in Africa. And we know about the ongoing intervention that God does over there. The fact that we hear the gospel and believe and are delivered from sin and death, and on top of that, transformed by Christ, well, that's a miracle. That would only happen with God's intervention. And so we remember God's supernatural acts of deliverance, and we praise God for his faithfulness. And we know that God is worthy to receive praise and glory because of who he is and what he does for his people. And so the righteous rejoice over God's blessings. And this is what David writes. Maybe. There we go. David says, as for God, his way is perfect. The word of the Lord is flawless. He is a shield for all who take refuge in him. For who is God besides the Lord? And who is the rock except our God? It is God who arms me with strength and makes my way perfect. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. He enables me to stand on the heights. He trains my hands for battle. My arms can bend a bow of bronze. You give me your shield of victory, and your right hand sustains me. You stoop down to make me great. You broaden the path beneath me so my ankles do not turn. And you can see why David would write this given all of his experiences over his life. Then we can skip ahead to verse 46. The verses in between talk about David's military battles, victories. And so they may apply to our battles. Most of us aren't in the army, so it'll be metaphorical, right? When we consider all of the things that God does for us, individually and as a community, what should we do? The righteous proclaim to the world that the Lord lives and extends the reign of his anointed king over the nations. Speaking of David in the first instance, and speaking of Jesus now. So we can say something that David said in 46-50, "The Lord lives, praise be to my rock, exalted be God my Savior. He is the God who avenges me, who subdues nations under me, who saves me from my enemies. You exalted me above my foes, from violent men you rescued me. Therefore I will praise you among the nations, O Lord. I will sing praises to your name. He gives his king great victories. He shows unfailing kindness to his anointed, to David and his descendants forever." And so we can tell people about the great victories that God has given to us. We can tell them about all of our struggles and how God has shown us his unfailing kindness. And a lot of these statements, again, refer to David's military victories, but I don't think it's a stretch to apply them to our battles in life and our battles against our adversary, the devil. Some people think that God is dead. And maybe that's because we aren't out there telling them what God has done for us. So yes, next week, the 25th anniversary of me being affirmed in as an attorney. I think I affirmed myself and didn't swear in honor of my Mennonite heritage. It was a little bit of a miracle that I even got into law school because when I was in college at Oregon State, I came under the influence of a guy named Dave, my friend, and he led me astray all the time. And I didn't get very good grades because I didn't go to class. You know, for college students out there, if you don't go to class, you're probably not going to get good grades. So you can take that away from there. But they let me in at Lewis and Clark, and so thank God for mercy and grace. And someday, like Brenda, I might be able to retire and sleep in late and then lie around the house all day, watching TV and eating bonbons. And of course, if you know Brenda, you know that she's not doing that. And don't worry if you're a client. I have no plans of retiring anytime soon. But God, God has a way of shaking things up and doing the unexpected. And so, and I guess the band could start making their way up here now if they want. So at this stage of my life, I'm very thankful. I'm thankful that I can say with David, "I love you, O Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer. My God is my rock, in whom I take refuge. He is my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. I call to the Lord, who is worthy of praise, and I am saved from my enemies." And I want to proclaim always, here and in public, "The Lord lives, praise be to my rock. Exalted be God my Savior." And I hope that you too can sing that song and that you will proclaim Jesus to the world.